Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Cowan, former Dean of the Annenberg School. In a moment, there will be an official welcoming from the Dean of the Annenberg School. But I want to tell everybody here that this is actually going to be broadcast or carried live to embassies and people around the country in the spirit of the free and open internet. And so, welcome to all of you, and I think this should be a fascinating conversation. There will be opening remarks by Secretary Posner, but then there will be truly a conversation with the rest of you. So with that, please join me in bringing to the dais here Dean Ernest Wilson.
It is really a great pleasure to welcome all the way from Washington, D.C., Michael Posner, who's the Assistant Secretary of State to the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. As you can see, that covers all the important stuff that many of us are concerned about. Michael was sworn into this position about 2 years ago, but prior to his government service, he's had a long and distinguished career in the protection of human rights, in political asylum, fair labor practices, free expression, and internet privacy. Prior to joining the State Department, he served as the executive director and then the president of a well-known human rights organization that many of you are aware of, I'm sure, Human Rights First. He led that organization to international respect and stature in areas such as refugee protection, challenging crimes against humanity, and combating discrimination. Michael's leadership is evident in many of the laws and initiatives that have shaped contemporary approaches to human rights and digital freedoms. I think he's a great example of one individual making a difference, working with groups, of course, but one individual with vision and passion can make a difference. Let me give you just a few examples. He played an absolutely key role in proposing and campaigning for the first U.S. law providing for political asylum, the very first, which became part of the Refugee Act of 1980. As a member of the White House Apparel Industry Partnership Task Force, he helped found the Fair Labor Association, an organization that brings together corporations, local leaders, universities, and NGOs to promote accountability for working conditions in the apparel industry. He was also involved in the development of an organization that I'm familiar with and do some work in, called the Global Network Initiative. And this also is a multi-stakeholder initiative aimed at promoting free expression and privacy on the internet. So the Secretary, as you see, is a firm believer in bringing together different voices from different parts of society across different institutions to talk about very important topics. One of those important topics is our discussion today on internet freedom as a foreign policy priority for the United States moving forward. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Michael Posner.
Thank you, Dean Wilson. It is a pleasure for me to be here, and I want to thank Jeff Cowan also for inviting me. And I want to honor you both for everything you've done, are doing to build the Annenberg Center as a leading venue for thought and discussion of some of the most critical issues of our time. I'm really eager to be here, delighted to be here to talk to journalists, aspiring journalists, public policy thinkers about internet freedom, which I think is one of the seminal free speech issues of our generation. As most of you know, our section of the State Department, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, is charged with helping to maintain the internet as an open space for free expression of all people. My boss, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, has made internet freedom a foreign policy priority, and Congress has given us $70 million to fund technology, training, and policy advocacy for internet freedom around the world. We funded a range of programs and trainings aimed at keeping activists in the most repressive societies safe, including a number of Syrians who tell us they are now using what they've learned in their current struggle for political freedom. Some of you may have read about the panic button, which is developed by one of our grantees. This now comes in both Nokia and Android versions, and they have encrypted voice and SMS capabilities. These were developed in response to what we heard from democracy and human rights activists on the front lines. If they're being arrested, as they often are, they can push a button that sends a text message to people to let them know they're in trouble. And it wipes out their contacts on their phone, which I have been told has already proved useful. We're making progress, but it's a struggle. And before we open the discussion, I want to outline 3 trends that are of deep concern to us. First, it's not new, of course, but we're confronting the increased attempts by some governments to control their citizens' peaceful online activities. Under international human rights law, people have the right to express themselves, and I quote, through any media regardless of frontiers. Yet interference from states continues in endless, nefarious, and inventive forms. The Committee to Protect Journalists has done an excellent job tracking these tactics, from illegal illicit surveillance and hacking, to offline intimidation of bloggers, to total internet shutdown. The Obama administration has staked out a principled stand by arguing that the rights of free expression, free assembly and association apply online just as they do to offline activity. Although it may be more difficult to enforce certain rights in the digital age, as authors, artists, and inventors are discovering. But the principles are the same. You don't break into a movie theater and steal film reels, and you don't have the right to steal movies online either. Second, we're seeing a growing number of repressive regimes get a hold of the latest, greatest Western technologies and use them to spy on their own citizens for the purpose of quashing peaceful political dissent, or even information that would allow citizens to know what's happening in their own communities. Journalists, bloggers, and activists are, of course, the primary targets. I'm sure many of you saw the reports about rebels several weeks ago overrunning Colonel Gaddafi's internet surveillance boiler room in Tripoli and finding it stuffed with Western technology. It's a complex story, but one I hope the media will follow and explore in depth. There are no easy solutions because, of course, the United States wants people in every country to have access to the newest connection technologies, including people in repressive places. And we want to allow our tech industry a free rein for innovation, avoiding onerous regulations as much as we can. At the same time, the use of technologies by repressive governments to suppress fundamental freedoms and freedom is an ongoing concern. At the State Department, we are monitoring this issue very closely, and we are urging companies to work together with like-minded governments and NGOs to figure out ways to minimize such misuse. Some companies are already doing this by designing innovative fixes to help their products protect users. In some cases, their young customers, they well know, are the Václav Havels and the Nelson Mandelas of the next generation. And we need to make this dialogue real, because the third disturbing trend, which I would argue has not received the attention it merits, is the growing efforts to give countries more control over how the internet is governed, to cut companies and civil society out of the conversation on shaping the internet's future. To give you one example, last month in New York, the governments of China and Russia, with support from others, came to the UN to suggest the need for an international code of conduct for information security. Were such a code to be enacted, it would almost inevitably erode media freedoms, and it would shift cyberspace away from a people-driven system to a system dominated by centralized government control. This is not a good idea. As I said at the outset, I've come here to exchange views, and so I look forward to our conversation about how together we can defend freedom and on these tough issues that are now playing out in some of the hardest places in the world. Thank you.
here and we'll make this a dialogue. Let me just start off though by asking you, one of the things that you have been doing, and you mentioned a little bit about this, is developing new technologies that can get around internet censorship. Maybe you could expand on that a little more. For example, there's the internet in a suitcase concept and so forth. I think a lot of people here will be interested to know, including people in the engineering school who are interested in these issues.
You know, when I came into the State Department in the fall of 2009, there was a congressionally mandated program and money for what was called Internet Freedom. And the assumption of the authors of that legislation was that there was a single problem, which was the efforts by governments like the Chinese and the Iranians to build a wall. And the need would be addressed by circumvention technologies to allow people in those countries to receive information from us. And that didn't seem quite right. And so we started to reach out to the community of technical experts, internet experts, people who are on the cutting edge of technology, and at the same time to reach out to activists and to say, what's really going on, what are the needs, and how do we marry the incredible technology and innovation in our own society with the needs of activists on the ground. And so we came up with two broad conclusions. One is that there's a lot of technology out there we take for granted that people living in a closed, repressive environment may get a hold of, but they don't know how to use it, they don't know what the risks are, they don't know what the opportunities are. And so one of the things we've done, I think very effectively, is to train trainers. We've now conducted training sessions with local experts, training activists to teach their communities. We've trained 5,000 activist trainers from all regions of the world, and they're giving people a better sense of what's the environment look like, what are the risks, and what are the opportunities. The second piece, going directly to your question, is that we've taken some of the money and we've created a kind of pool, almost like a venture fund, and said there is not one thing that's needed here. There are certain things that are needed with regard to internet security and internet privacy. There are things that are needed with mobile phones. So much of the world is now getting information as well as communicating by mobile phones. Let's again look at what are the possibilities to expand coverage and also to provide technical fixes like this panic button. And we found some of the most interesting people in LA and Berkeley and in New York and around the country who've been operating in the commercial sector and are now realizing that this is where the action is, and their own values propel them to create nonprofit organizations that we're working with and funding for some of this startup technology.
Well, I think it'll be fun later to see if there are some, how many people are engineering students or faculty here? Not too many. But there's such interesting things. For example, I read that the Broadcasting Board of Governors is using technology that's really used to avoid spam filters as a way of getting information into Cuba, because their whole thing is that you never know where the things are coming from. Could you describe that sort of technology a minute?
Yeah, you know, I think, again, I'm not a technologist, but it's one of the things, you know, governments governments are going at this in multiple ways. Again, the Chinese model is to have tens of thousands of people monitoring what's going on, blocking content, blocking access. Some governments, though, have decided that they can use spam and viruses as a way of making both information harder to get access to and shutting down sites that are doing useful work. And so part of what we're trying to do is to figure out the ways, again, to protect the integrity of the information, protect privacy, and give people warning when governments are coming at them. Governments are also paying people to provide disinformation. China has the 50-cent movement. They pay people 50 cents to write things in support of government policy. And this goes on not with dozens of people, but with tens of thousands of people all the time. So we're looking at both technology to protect, technology to provide greater openness to the internet, and also technology to ensure that privacy of users is being protected.
Do people want to start getting into this conversation? So if you'll identify yourself, and then you're welcome to make a point as well as ask the question so that it's genuinely a conversation. We have a chance here to talk with the leading person in the federal government working on internet freedom, which is a real priority of the Secretary of State and of this administration and of a lot of people in Congress, I dare say.
Yeah.
Very interesting area. Well, while I'm waiting for people to come up with questions or comments, one of the issues that's arisen, and the Secretary talked, she gave two major speeches on internet freedom, both of them really, really interesting. I would commend them to people here. But in the second one, she addressed directly the question I'm going to ask, because it's on a lot of people's minds, including a lot of journalists, which is how do you square the notion of internet freedom with our attitude toward WikiLeaks and Julius Assange?
You know, I have all kinds of unenviable jobs in government, and one of them, which has made me very conscious of, all related to the WikiLeaks issue, is we are the point agency in the government for trying to figure out how to protect people who've given information to some government official. It's now public. And there are literally hundreds of cases now in countries around the world where people are at risk because what were intended as private communications within the government have now become public. So I don't see any inconsistency between our not only desire but our obligation to have private communication within government about sensitive subjects. When people show up in a U.S. embassy and they want to tell us about a human rights violation or official corruption, our ability to be effective on those issues depends on our ability to take that information in the manner it's given to us, which is confidentially, and to share it with people in the government so that we can have the right response. That to me is think about journalists. You know, journalists would not want their notes, their intake, to be the subject of a public examination. We think about it in our own lives. You know, we communicate with our friends, with our family. There is a notion of privacy that ought to prevail and needs to prevail. That to me is a very different subject than internet freedom. We believe that the internet as a medium, it ought to be free and open, a platform for robust discussion, whether about political issues or about innovation or education or economics. And that's a principle that we hold dear, and we're going to continue to push for it as part of a human rights strategy. That doesn't mean that every single communication on the internet needs to be open, and in fact, if it is, we lose something that's essential to its success.
You know, deans have bosses too. And Ernie just got a call from one of his. Ernie, do you want to say anything before you part?
Yeah, I do. One thing I want to say that the kind of conversation that we're having now very much reflects the interest of the Annenberg School in trying to wrestle with these issues. And also the great centers, like the center that Jeff Cowan has, that Professor Cowan leads. So I just want to encourage all of you to continue to attend these kinds of debates where we try to wrestle with tough topics. And I especially want to thank Jeff Cowan and for inviting Secretary Posner to join us today and share his ideas. I know he has a very busy schedule. He was describing the travels that he has to take when he leaves here, so we really are delighted and honored that he was able to join us. And I apologize, but I just got something from my secretary on my cell phone that says the boss needs to see me, so I'm going to have to go do that. But thank you.
Thanks, Ernie. Thanks, Ernie. There's always a boss. But let's explore this just a little bit more, and I do urge you to, if you put your hands up if you have a question you want to ask. Actually, Clay Doobie runs our China Institute, and Clay, obviously you think about this in one of the target countries. Feel free to make a comment before you ask a question. Well, and maybe people could stand when they do this so they can be heard by the whole group.
It's obvious that China looms large for the U.S. government and for the American public as a whole, and many of your comments focus on that. I have a question that maybe just as uncomfortable as the one that Jeff just asked, having to do with content. It's fine to create these ways around filters and to leapfrog the Great Firewall of China, that sort of thing. But are we simultaneously limiting our message delivery capability for the future, our knowledge about these places for the future, as well as our ability to get in now? And I'm thinking specifically, you mentioned $70 million for new technology, training trainers, building capacity, that sort of thing. And that, coincidentally, is about the same amount that was taken out of the Title VI program, which involves training people who can speak Arabic, can speak Chinese, can speak Korean, these other target languages, as well as another $70 million that was taken out of the international business programs, those kinds of things. And I'm thinking, too, of the cutbacks at the Voice of America, something, of course, that Jeff knows intimately, and a decision to bet big on the web and perhaps to reduce America's governmental voice over the airwaves. I was wondering if you could just address these priorities.
Sure. To my mind, those things are not exclusive, and the fact that they both happen to have $70 million, I don't think anybody ever sat and thought, let's take it away from, training people in languages or the Voice of America. Those are important pieces of what we do. I'm conscious every day of the gap between what we know and what we need to know about the Middle East, South Asia, and the catching up we have to do in terms of language, culture, etc. So I think it's essential to keep pursuing those programs. It's essential that our voice, the voice through the various Broadcasting Board of Governors, Domain, Voice of America, etc., continue to be out there, and we are very supportive of that. We work together all the time. But I think, if cooler heads prevailed, we ought to be able to figure out how to do all of these things as part of an integrated strategy.
And by the way, from the standpoint of the Voice of America, what we always faced with broadcasting the world, now technology is taking things so much further, was jamming technology. And I think part of it and then our efforts were to figure out how do you get past the jamming, and I think in a way there's an analogy to what you're trying to do here.
Yeah. I mean, jamming, and again, the walls are part of it, but it's also clear to me, and this has been a part of the shift in people's thinking in our office and in the State Department, it's very important that our messages and our information get into closed societies. It's equally important that people be able to talk to one another. And so in a place like China, the things that are on people's mind may not be what we're first thinking about, but when they can start to share information about environmental issues, about labor issues, about official malfeasance and corruption of authority, those stories loom large, and it's that conversation within China that is provoking the greatest interest on the internet. And so we need to do both. We need to have our information, we need to let people communicate with each other, and frankly, communicate with us.
One topic, if you follow this stuff, one topic that's been very interesting to read about is that one of the groups that's trying to develop this technology to combat censorship is thought to have a connection with the Falun Gong. And I think there's been a whole debate about how involved we would be in supporting that particular group. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, there are multiple technologies now and multiple firms and entities working on these ways to get around the firewalls. And our approach has been, and what we've done over the last several years, is to, again, invest in several different alternatives. One of them is a group that is part of a broader consortium that has some connection to the Falun Gong. But
and do we hear from the Chinese when that happens?
Oh, sure. We hear from the Chinese about all kinds of things.
Anything you'd like to share? Of course, you're going to be broadcast all around the world.
Well, President Obama believes in a principled engagement, and our engagement with China is robust. We talk about economics and trade, and we talk about security issues, and we talk about human rights. And we're not shy about saying we're concerned.
Have I got any more takers? Kimberly. And again, if I'd ask people to introduce themselves and then feel comfortable making a point before asking questions, it's a discussion.
Kimberly Marto Emerson, co-chair of Human Rights Watch here in Los Angeles. I was just curious as to how you all are feeling in the administration about the proposed revised GOFA legislation that Chris Smith is trying to get through, that actually changes it to ensure that companies take into account human rights considerations when they do internet business with other countries. Talk a little bit about the legislation.
Sure. Yeah, this is I think the third iteration of legislation that Congressman Smith from New Jersey, Chris Smith, has introduced. And I think in general, and this is true of a lot of legislation, the State Department government tends to be wary of or anxious about ways of legislating these things. However, having said that, the sentiment behind what he's done, what Howard Berman's done, what others have done, Brownback when he was a senator, Senator Kaufman when he was a senator, Senator Casey. There's a lot of interest in these issues. There's now an internet task force in the Congress. We support that. We work closely with them. Our view is that we ought to be given the latitude to work on these issues at an executive level. The legislation is not going to help us do that. So we've worked with Chris Smith's office. We'll continue to work with them, but I think we have a different view of how much of this is federal regulation, how much of it's executive action.
And back. And again, please introduce yourself. If you feel comfortable, make the point, not just asking questions.
Hi, I'm Emily. I have actually a clarification and a follow-up question. My first is, was it pointed out that we spent $70 million towards this project?
$70 million over really 4 years, yes.
Okay, and then my question is, why are we choosing internet freedom as a human rights objective as opposed to other human rights, such as like human trafficking, euthanasia, when clearly other countries, like other third world countries and developing countries, don't even have the internet to be protected by?
It's a good question. I think I view the internet freedom issue as a broader human rights issue relating to free speech, free assembly, and free association. And so this is a vehicle, this is a technical piece of a larger effort that we apply across the world, especially in societies where people don't have the liberty or freedom to stand out in the public square, to speak their mind about things that are wrong in government, to organize, to associate and assemble. And I think the technology is evolving so quickly. If you think about cell phones as a part of this piece, and it's an important part, people are communicating now, even in societies 10 years ago where there was essentially no telecommunication. Now they have cell phones. I mean, cell phones are rapidly expanding in African countries, for example. They leapfrogged over conventional landlines. And people are, in China, there are 800 million people with cell phones, 500 million people with internet access. We're talking about a growing population. We estimate, others estimate, that there'll be 5 billion people in the next 10 years that are online or connected. That's most of the world. So I think our notion is this is, in fact, the venue in which these issues are playing out. It's not just in the most sophisticated Western countries. It's really a global phenomenon, and it's about to get more so. And this is an opportunity for us to amplify our human rights concerns about free speech, assembly, and association.
But I think in terms of that question, before we conclude our conversation today, just for people who are interested in human rights more broadly, maybe we could talk a little bit more about your portfolio, because your portfolio, this happens to be a session on internet freedom, but that's only a fraction of the things that you do. In fact, maybe for just a minute, because there are a lot of people interested in human rights and a lot of students, you could sort of go through the range of things that your office engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to start with that Secretary Clinton has probably devoted as much or more priority attention to human rights than, than ever before. She is passionately committed to supporting vulnerable populations, women, young girls, minorities. So the trafficking issues you mentioned are important part of that agenda. There's another office in the State Department that works on that. There's an ambassador for women's issues, Milan Verveer, who's worked with the Secretary for 20-some years on those issues. But our portfolio deals with a range of what I would call traditional human rights issues relating to, prisoners and torture and disappearances and denials of due process, free speech, free press, the importance of an independent judicial system. We have a democracy portfolio that looks at how do you advance and support efforts by people to choose their own destiny. We're dealing with that in Tunisia and Egypt right now, in a range of countries in Africa and around the world. And then we have a labor portfolio which deals with the global piece of what we do domestically, which is to allow and encourage people to organize and bargain collectively and to have worker rights part of our global strategy. So it's a big agenda. We have 140, 150 people working in a bureau. 5 of them are working on internet freedom. We have a lot of daily confrontations with governments about a whole range of serious abuses of the kinds of things you're talking about.
Bring some other people in back there. And again, please introduce yourself and feel free to make a comment as well as ask a question.
My name is Mehdi Yamilad. The point I wanted to make, I do some research on in case of Iran, and based on some of the research I've done, it seems from 30 million Iranians who are online, only about 1 million Iranians have access to free information using the proxy tools that are being some of them with the support of U.S. government. The point I want to make is that it's basically we are very far from the ideal situation where at least half of the population has access to free information, and the type of kind of funding is actually here, like $7 billion over 4 years. It's a great step, but I think to crack this problem, we need to think bigger, and this is the kind of problem that the Iranian government just in 1 year spent about $70 million to combat. To based on censorship, on surveillance, and so on. So China, Iran, and other governments, dictatorships are spending far more money on this. And one thing I haven't heard enough, I think most of the time people who are talking about this type of funding, they usually compare with other type of funding, like maybe education but I think this kind of funding should be spent compared directly with the military budget that's spending in the Middle East, because that's in a very in 1 week probably there are billions of dollars spent on what's happening in the Middle East, and this could have probably far more impact in terms of the long-term goals of the United States.
Iran as a case study is clearly one of the most interesting in the world, and one that I think has been one of the things that's inspired you. Maybe you could both respond to this and talk a little bit about the specific situation in Iran.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. Actually, the situation in Iran is one of the things that provoked the Congress to provide as much money as we have received. And there's actually a separate act of Congress that presses for greater investment in opening up lines of communication, including through the internet, with Iran. So actually a significant portion, a portion of the money we spend is directed at trying to open up that process. We are very mindful, and especially since the terribly flawed and disrupted elections in 2009, we're very aware of the daily indignities of the Iranian government and the energy, as you say, they put into preventing Iranian citizens from communicating with each other, and the crackdowns that have been part of their routine of people who in any way challenge what they're doing. We've worked both, frankly, it's a complicated business because we want to do it in a way that protects the people we're working with. We're also very mindful that Ahmadinejad and others in the leadership there are quick to demonize us. So anything we do becomes part of their propaganda. So we've been, I would say, discreet but very focused, and we are not at all shy. And I've done it. I've testified 2 or 3 times in Congress. I've gone to the UN when the Iranians came for their Universal Periodic Review. We are out there all the time, documenting what they're doing and publicizing it.
Just before we turn to the next person, do you have any, are you in touch with a lot of people on the ground there, and what are they experiencing in Iran?
So based on very continuously there have been more restrictions. For example, just last week, the Iranian government tried to block VPN access for Iranians inside Iran because VPN access in fact it was very common for last year. So I think what they are asking for, things that I hear are for more ambitious things to do, like for example, working on satellite solutions to provide internet downloads or some sort of internet accessibility. Basically, just things that all will cost more and are more ambitious, but those are the solutions that could provide actual change from this.
Thank you. Good questions over here.
Hi, Naomi Light from USC Center. Actually, to follow up on the Iran question, we just had VOA Persian News Network Director Rami Ashgard with us here at Annenberg last week, and he spoke about Iran's efforts to create a halal internet where it will be completely closed from the outside world in August 2012. What are you doing to address that and work with global partners on this issue?
It's a good question. The third concern that I raised in my opening comments is about exactly that. There are various initiatives by various governments to either create national internets or sub-global internets, and at the same time to regulate the international regulatory framework. So this initiative that I mentioned, that's Russia and China from September, it's the first time they've come together. But as you say, the Iranians have talked about a halal internet, the Chinese have talked about a Chinese internet. And we really, I think, almost inevitably in the next few years are going to confront a real test for our approach, which is that there is a neutral, open internet that crosses borders. And it's available to everyone as a common framework. Secretary Clinton has talked about the town square of the 21st century. Our notion is that the internet has grown in part because governments haven't been too involved. It's grown in a kind of slightly chaotic but interesting way. And its openness is its strength. And clearly there are governments, especially governments that want to constrain debate in their own societies, that are extremely uncomfortable with that. And they're looking for some regulatory way, some way technically, to make it less open and free. That's what the fight's all about.
It's a great question. And back over there.
Robert Williams, I'm a professor of political science at Pepperdine. And I wanted to ask you about a lawsuit that was filed earlier this year, an alien tort statute suit filed in California on behalf of Falcon members against Cisco Systems. I'm wondering if this is the kind of thing that the State Department would weigh in on or take a position, since the allegation in the suit is that Cisco Systems built part of the internet architecture that the Chinese government has used to identify Falcon members in advance of arresting them.
Let me answer that in 2 ways. First, to say, I'm not going to comment on the particular lawsuit, but I will note that the Supreme Court granted a hearing in another case, and in fact 2 cases in this term, which is going to evaluate the jurisdictional limits of the Alien Tort Claims Act and the Torture Victim Protection Act. So that case will be affected by the court's broader review, and that's going on right now. What I would say broadly is that we believe, and actually I'm going to be in San Francisco tomorrow speaking to an internet freedom meeting organized by Silicon Valley companies and others. And one of the themes for me is to think about the affirmative responsibility and obligations of companies in this sector. And I think there are two aspects of that. One, what you described as part of a broader discussion of when do companies make a judgment as a part of their, business model that includes human rights to avoid or not deal with governments that are going to use their technology in a negative way, in a way that is repressive. The other piece, which I think is also critical, is how do companies affirmatively promote internet freedom and privacy, individually and collectively. And that's part of the effort that Google, Yahoo, Microsoft have begun to do some of that in the context of the Global Network Initiative that the Dean mentioned. But I think it's a broader question. This is a young industry. They tend to be very engaged in a whole range of sort of charitable and philanthropic areas. But in terms of their own operations, I think this is exactly the right time to begin thinking, what's the collective response of the private sector to help advance this agenda?
Justin?
Yeah, Justin Connolly from Human Rights Watch. So you had said earlier that you felt that it wasn't up to Congress to regulate that kind of behavior in companies, that you would like to reserve it for executive. I'm curious what specific steps you would recommend to the Global Network Initiative or to these companies what would you say to Cisco? Sell the machines to China or not sell the machines to China? I guess I'm saying, what do you think is the right thing to do, and then what do you think is the administration's position?
It's a good question, and I'm not going to, probably not going to satisfy you with this answer, but I think that our role as a government is to play a reinforcing role with companies that are limited in their ability to operate in closed environments. I think we can do it individually and with other governments, but we can't do it alone. And so the first part of the answer to your question is, I think there's a real value in companies coming together in trying to figure out what's a common approach. What are the standards and what are the ways in which they can collectively reinforce those standards and work with us? The second part of the question relates to what companies should not do. And there is some U.S. law sanctioning behavior of companies that are in effect complicit with governments that are committing gross human rights violations. But I think this goes beyond that. It really is an affirmative obligation of companies to take a look at the world in which they're operating. I'm not saying stop operating in risky places, but be mindful of their own responsibility to be attentive to where's the stuff going, and in some situations to not make those deals. I'm not going to comment on a particular company, but I think a lot more can and should be done. I'll tell you, when companies are shut down, when some of the internet companies have a problem in a tough place, we get the call very quickly. And what I say to them individually, and I would say broadly, is it's very hard to do a one-off response that's going to be effective. We need a comprehensive approach that brings in the main players in the industry, and then we can work as partners with them to make progress in some of these things.
For the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to open this up to broader human rights questions if people want to ask them. And the Secretary of State made some news this weekend when she began to talk about the human rights community, human rights organizations asking questions about the manner in which Gaddafi was killed. Do you have anything you'd like to make news about on that subject today?
No, I think her comments and our comments are consistent. Obviously, whatever our thoughts about Gaddafi or any other leader and the illegitimacy of the way they've governed, we believe that people if somebody's detained, they ought to have a hearing, and they ought to be treated according to principles of law. And the Libyan government, I would say going forward, has the TNC will turn into a government, and we're going to have a range of interesting, tough discussions with them about how they deal with the past. They have 42 years of bad history, but they've got to go forward. They should go forward in a way that begins to write a new chapter that's based on rule of law, based on principles of human rights. And that starts out with, when you pick somebody up who's done bad things, hold them, prosecute them, hold them accountable through the law.
People can ask questions on other human rights questions or continue internet freedom, please.
Paulette Walsh from American Women for International Understanding. And, we've been tracking a lot about all the different Arab Spring countries and what they're going through, especially specifically about women actually becoming a part of their societies. Seeing Tunisia right now, but as you know, many will follow. Is there a strategy in place, or how do you see your internet or your cell phone use as a way that might be able to encourage or support that?
I'd answer, the question is what's our strategy for integrating women more into the democratic transitions that are occurring in the Middle East? And I don't view this so much as an internet strategy, although there may be a piece of it. I think we've been very mindful of the fact that in places like Egypt or Tunisia, women are very much part of the movement on the street, and they're well represented. And then when it gets to the next phase, that you begin to look at political power, elections, who's in what parties, all of a sudden they're on the sidelines. And that's deeply troubling. One of the things, again, Secretary Clinton has said, and I repeat all the time, when we look at what's a sustainable, lasting democracy, one element of it is empowerment of women. And that can't be a kind of collateral issue, it's a central issue. So in all of the diplomacy we do, in all of the grant making we do for the various initiatives that are trying to build political parties and voter education and things, we are very mindful, and it's very much an explicit part that we are constantly reinforcing the question, where are the women in this equation, and what can we do and what can groups do? I mean, again, we can't make the decision, but I think we have reinforced the priority we place on this at every occasion. I can assure you, Secretary Clinton is not shy on this subject. And whether it's Afghanistan, the toughest places, she is constantly there, and I'm there right beside her and echoing the same message, saying this is an essential piece of a democratic transition.
One way in which I think new technology and the internet is relevant to women's rights is that there are a lot of places where women can't go out, but they can participate with new technologies. Yeah. And I think that's been something to keep in mind with all of this. Time for a couple more questions. In the back, please.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Inzumi from South Korea. I'll take 30 seconds. I'm asking you about the moral ethical standard versus internet freedom or freedom of speech. About 3 years ago, the channel CBC News anchor woman said that when the news comes in, I'll check where's the source, what's the source. Is the source reliable? And is this story true or not? And the story was the candidate Obama went to when was the child went to terrorist Islamic school, widespread. And she said, I checked all 3 criteria and it didn't fit in, so she didn't report it. So my question to you is, I strongly believe in freedom of speech, but also they should have a moral ethical standard, put information on internet or media. What do you say? I think we are abusing our freedom in a way.
Well, what you describe is a condition of human behavior since the beginning of time. People, they're good reporters and they're not good reporters. There's good information and there's faulty information. The internet simply amplifies it because it's so powerful and it's so pervasive. Hopefully, and I'm sure it's true here, there are journalism schools like the Annenberg School that are teaching people to be professional journalists. We don't have at this point, I guess, a formal discipline, although I guess it's coming, of how one communicates on the internet, and there isn't the distinction between a professional reporter and the rest of us. But that doesn't mean that we abandon the enterprise. One of the things we say, there's a lot of bad speech on the internet. The best thing you can do is overcome bad speech with good speech. the answer isn't to shut down conversation. It's to get thoughtful, serious, honest reflections out there and to make sure that those things are heard in the marketplace of ideas.
We have time for 2 more questions, but before I call a next person, I just want to tell about my own previous experience with Secretary Posner, because I think it really illustrates what an interesting and innovative person he's been in his previous life. When he headed Human Rights First, he arranged for a meeting in Los Angeles on the subject of torture as a method of interrogation of prisoners or people might have critical information. And you brought together some of the top interrogators from the CIA and the FBI and the Defense Department and the commandant of one of the military academies, West Point. And along with them were the people who were responsible for the most popular television shows, including 24, that featured torture as a method of interrogation. And at that fascinating session, the commandant of West Point and others said, we train our people that torture doesn't work as a method of interrogation. But they're being trained on popular television shows in a different way. And I think that was a fascinating way in which you sort of brought to people's attention in a very profound way that had an impact on some programming, although you might not think so, some realities.
One of the, just a quick anecdote on that, when we went to 24, we spent a day talking to the producers and the writers. And they were asking all kinds of questions of these interrogators. How do you do this? How do you do, how do you do waterboarding? How do you do sleep deprivation? They kept saying, we don't do that. And so finally, one of the interrogators, a guy who'd been in the Army for 35 years, said, who are the interrogators you've been talking to? The show had been on the air 6 years, and they said, oh, you're the first ones we ever talked to. So that was...
Okay, 2 more questions. Back here.
Hi, my name is Ben Pham, and recently there's a lot of rumors about Yahoo being put up for sales again. So one of the Chinese internet company, Alibaba, is interested in purchasing Yahoo. So I was wondering if you can comment on the data security of that, especially of a foreign entity owning a U.S. company, as well as the Chinese government using it as a way to monitor U.S. citizens.
I don't know the ins and outs of that. I think Alibaba actually is now a joint venture with Chinese partners and Yahoo, and I don't know what's happening. But I think your question points to a bigger challenge for us, which is that the internet, the industry, the commercial industry is expanding. And there are many companies now based in other places, China, India, elsewhere. And we have a global challenge to try to, again, if we're talking about what's the appropriate role of industry, we can't be just talking to companies that are based in the Silicon Valley or based in Seattle. We have to have a global discussion. And I think the way you do that is you start to set some real standards, you get best practices, and you try to encourage companies to come up to those standards and make users aware that there are differences between those that are taking this seriously and those who aren't.
One last question. This one here.
I'm a master's candidate in public policy department. My name is Posner. I just wanted to ask, after what you were talking about with the 24 and your view on how, because the UK and the US have such a domination in terms of creative arts, especially in television and internet media, like how do you feel, especially since around the world it's even more, it's easier for them to access through the internet. How do you feel that should affect, like you were saying, in the show 24 they use a lot of torture as like a narrative device, but then they've never talked with interrogators. Like, do you think that that should, because like television and American media are so available to countries around the world, do you think there should be any type of like looking into how they write and like what devices they use in terms of torture and the like?
It's a good question, and I'm a bit wary coming to Southern California and talking to the entertainment industry about how to operate. What we said then, and I would still say it is, I totally respect the creative process, the fact that sometimes to tell a story you have to simplify, create a mad, dramatic moment, all of that. This is not my world or my business. I do think, though, that the entertainment industry, like any other, ought to just be aware of the challenges and the opportunities. You know, it isn't, we never said to any of those shows, stop depicting this. What we did say is, there's an opportunity here to have something that's both dramatically interesting and will make people think. And so that really is, I guess, my message, that I think there's ample room to both be creative and successful, and at the same time be aware of the opportunity to make people think about what are some of the underlying issues at stake.
And I think your point partly is that it isn't only teaching our own military inadvertently who are watching television, but it's teaching people all around the world. And so that's something that is, in public diplomacy, you want to be mindful of. I want to take the prerogative of asking a final question, especially because we have a room of people students who may sometime want to go into public service themselves. So you've been in private life with an NGO trying to have an impact in an idealistic way on issues. Now you're in the government, in a government that an administration you believe in. But could perhaps you describe a little bit what it's like to go from being a private activist to being a government servant?
Yeah, you know, in 2 sentences or 3 sentences, I've actually appreciated the power and the potential of our government to make a difference in a positive way, in a way that I didn't fully appreciate on the outside. It is striking to me in how many places, how often people in the NGO community that I used to work as part of will say, what the United States government says and does about this issue is the thing that most matters in our ability to have our voices heard. So first point is the potential is fantastic. The second point is the government is endlessly complicated and conflicted, which I sort of knew, but it's another thing to be on the inside and see it. And the third piece, which to me is the most gratifying, I suppose, of all this, is it's interesting to me how often you can succeed in promoting a big idea like the internet freedom ideas in spite of the complexity and the contradictions in our government. People, if you have a good idea and you're enthusiastic about promoting it, you can make a difference more often than I realize.
I know that in a couple of minutes you're going to be meeting with a smaller group here, maybe for about 5 minutes as we break. You'll be available for people to come up and have conversations with you for a moment. Please join me in thanking Mike Posner for being with us today.